Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world that isn't your own, though you might recognize the shadows of it when you wake at 3 a.m. and scroll your phone in the dark. Imagine you're standing in an Elizabethan bedchamber, the air heavy with smoke from a tallow candle that sputters more than it glows. The rushes on the floor crunch faintly beneath your bare feet, releasing that earthy smell that never quite goes away. The hour is late, the moon is climbing above crooked rooftops, and in this age there is no electricity, no buzz of appliances, no glowing rectangles to keep you company. It's just you, the darkness, and the peculiar rhythm of a night that never runs straight through. Because here you don't sleep once. You sleep twice, and yes, you probably wouldn't survive this arrangement in your modern apartment. Your body would rebel after a week. Your boss would fire you for showing up with pillow-creased cheeks, and your neighbors might file a noise complaint when you started reciting midnight psalms. Still, this was the norm for centuries, and tonight you're going to drift inside it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments, and maybe we'll see a little map of midnight owls forming across the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open the creaking oak door and step into the chamber. The fire on the hearth is guttering, throwing weak light across the carved bedposts. The bed itself looks inviting only if you don't think too hard about what's stuffed inside the mattress. Straw, maybe feathers, or sometimes nothing more than ropes pulled taut across a wooden frame. You lie down anyway, pulling a coarse wool blanket over your shoulders. It smells faintly of smoke and lanolin, and you wonder who else has used it before you. The first sleep begins quietly. It usually starts soon after sundown, because candles are expensive and firewood costs time and effort to chop. The Elizabethans turned in early, not out of virtue but out of sheer necessity. Sleep descended as soon as darkness fell, whether you liked it or not. Historians still argue whether the habit was driven more by long winter nights or by daily labor exhausting everyone into early collapse. But either way, once the sun slipped behind the horizon, you slipped beneath the covers. As you drift off, you can hear muffled sounds from outside. A watchman's staff hits the cobblestones, announcing the hour. Somewhere a dog howls. The night is not silent, but it is unlit, and that makes it feel endless. You sink deeper. Your breathing slows, and your first sleep wraps around you like a cocoon. This initial slumber lasts for a few hours, usually until midnight or a bit beyond. Doctors of the day, those grand old fellows in ruffled collars, considered this phase perfect for digestion. They claimed the body worked best if you let the food settle, then rose again before returning to rest. It's a theory that sounds suspiciously convenient, like the Elizabethan version of don't eat carbs after 6 p.m. But hey, at least you get a break to stretch your legs. During this early sleep, the dreams come quickly. Elizabethans believed dreams carried messages, warnings, or even prophecies. A nightmare might mean your neighbor secretly envied your goose, or that you'd been dabbling too much in unholy thoughts. Some families kept dream books, little guides that translated images into predictions, sort of like medieval fortune cookies, except you couldn't eat them, and they weren't nearly as cheerful. The odd part, everyone accepted this double sleep pattern as normal. The phrase first sleep pops up in plays, diaries, and even court documents. You might hear a character say, "I awoke from my first sleep," as casually as we might say, "I'll grab coffee in the morning." It wasn't exotic. It was just Tuesday. Lying here, you feel your body's weight pressing into the mattress. Your eyes flicker open now and then, when the fire pops or a mouse scurries along the baseboard. In the distance, a bell tolls midnight. You don't panic at the interruption. No one expects you to sleep straight through. You're simply in the middle of the cycle, the quiet hinge of the night where one sleep ends and another waits to begin. Oddly enough, some modern scientists tried recreating this rhythm in the 1990s. They placed volunteers in rooms without artificial light, and after a few weeks, the subjects began naturally splitting their rest into two halves, with a calm waking period in between. It turns out the Elizabethans weren't strange. They were just tuned to the natural length of night, which is another way of saying your ancestors were basically better at listening to their circadian rhythm than you are with your 5 alarms and triple-shot lattes. Now, as the last embers fade, you sense the first sleep thinning. You turn over, the blanket slipping slightly, and you realize the intermission is about to begin. Your eyes open more fully. The chamber is shadowy but familiar. You're awake, and strangely enough, that's exactly what you're supposed to be. You stir, blinking into the dim light that's more suggestion than illumination. The fire has sunk low, barely alive, and the room is cool enough that your breath might show if you exhale sharply. This, oddly, is not the end of your night. It's only halftime. What you've just woken from is what Elizabethans called their first sleep. The first sleep, as the phrase implies, was only part one of a neatly divided rest. After 3 or 4 hours, people often found themselves naturally awake again, not restless, not insomniac, just alert. It was the body's rhythm, and it made sense when nights stretched 12-14 hours long in winter. Staying unconscious that entire time would have been like running a sleep marathon, and no one had the training plan for that. So you'd stir awake around midnight, rub your eyes and accept that the next couple of hours were meant for something else. You sit up in bed. The straw mattress shifts under your weight, groaning like it has secrets to tell. Beside you, maybe a sibling or a servant shifts too, because personal space is not really an Elizabethan concept. Beds were shared, often by several people, and the awkward elbow in your ribs was just part of the deal. If you were lucky, you at least got the outer edge where the air was fresher and the blankets easier to tug toward yourself. Your first sleep was considered heavy, the kind that repaired the body. Physicians of the time liked to classify it as the moment when vapors from digestion settled down, leaving your blood calmer. Historians still argue whether this medical logic was science, superstition, or just a polite way of telling people not to eat a whole roasted goose right before bed. Whatever the reasoning, it worked. And it was so normal that most folks probably never questioned it. Now, as you blink in the dark, you recall that this awakening was predictable enough to plan around. If you needed to check on the fire, to nurse a baby, to whisper prayers, or to sneak outside to relieve yourself in the freezing air, this was the window. Households expected it. Neighbors expected it. Even animals seemed to stir in rhythm. Roosters crowing long before dawn, as if they too had schedules divided into halves. Some records describe people using this break for more intimate purposes. Theologians and midwives both noted that couples often preferred the interval between first and second sleep for conceiving children. The body was rested, the mind less distracted, and perhaps the blankets a little warmer by then. You don't need to imagine too vividly, but know that candlelight wasn't the only thing flickering in those hours. Quirky evidence comes from legal documents, where witnesses casually mention rising after first sleep to fetch water or to spy a suspicious figure in the lane. These offhand remarks show how matter-of-fact the custom was. Nobody paused to explain it, just as you wouldn't stop to explain brushing your teeth. Everyone knew what first sleep meant. If you tilt your head toward the shuttered window, you hear faint noises from outside, a horse stamping its hoof, the muffled call of the watchman announcing all's well. The city is drowsy but not entirely still. Somewhere across town, another household is waking too, yawning and shuffling through the dark. And you realize You are part of a shared ritual that links every bedchamber in Elizabethan England. A collective breathing in and out of sleep. You rub your arms against the chill, pulling the blanket tighter. The candle stub on the table has collapsed into a puddle of wax, long spent. If you want more light, you'd have to strike flint or tend the fire. But you probably won't. Most people accepted the dimness, moving slowly, learning to live with shadows. Think of it like Elizabethan mood lighting. Great for prayer, gossip, or creeping out your siblings with sudden whispers. Doctors, ever eager to justify habits, argued that first sleep ended when the body had done enough natural purging and the humors were realigned. They suggested it was healthy to get up, stretch, maybe even walk about the house before settling in again. To a modern ear, that sounds suspiciously like every sleep coach telling you not to stare at your phone at 2 a.m., but to get up and read a boring book. Except instead of a paperback, you might have a psalter or a wooden spoon. Now imagine yourself in this room, the first sleep already behind you. Your body feels oddly alert, though you know the night is far from over. The second sleep waits ahead, like the promise of dessert after a heavy meal. For now, though, you're in the threshold, awake but not truly in the daytime world. This is the hinge moment, the pause between acts, where anything from prayer to plotting to porridge might unfold. And so you linger, half dreaming, half listening, knowing the story of your night is still unfinished. You shuffle across the rush-covered floor, your toes brushing over stalks that crunch and release a faintly sour, grassy odor. It's the interval that everyone expected, the between-sleep hours. This is the time when the house breathes differently, neither locked in the silence of first sleep, nor bustling in the labors of the morning. You feel the fire's last embers glow just enough to guide your path, a warm pulse in an otherwise dim world. This waking stretch, usually lasting an hour or two, had a peculiar character. Families might sit together at the hearth, talking in hushed voices, so as not to wake children still dozing. Some would kneel in prayer, whispering psalms and supplications while the night pressed heavy against shuttered windows. Others indulged in snacks, perhaps bread soaked in warm ale, or a hunk of cheese left over from supper. You can picture yourself chewing slowly, savoring a crusty bite. The taste sharper than usual because everything feels sharper at midnight. The quirky part. Some Elizabethans took this time as perfect for creative work. A merchant might draft letters by candlelight, scratching with a quill on rough paper. A scholar could ponder Latin texts, convinced the quiet hours sharpened his mind. Even servants, those perpetual engines of labor, sometimes used the gap to finish chores, tending fires, sweeping hearths, or fetching water before the morning rush. You, of course, are just enjoying the novelty of being awake when you're supposed to be asleep. A guilty thrill that makes the minutes feel stolen. Historians still argue whether this waking phase was a universal social experience or more common among urban households where bells, watchmen, and noise made staying asleep difficult. Rural families with fewer disturbances might have enjoyed longer stretches of uninterrupted rest. Yet evidence of the two-sleep model appears across regions and classes, enough to suggest the pattern was more than coincidence, it was culture. You sit by the hearth, and the warmth tickles your cheeks as the rest of the room remains cool. A sibling stirs behind you, grumbling at your absence in the bed. Maybe you throw back a cheeky whisper, "Go back to your second sleep, I'll be along." It's playful, but it captures the normalcy of the phrase. Everyone knew what came next. The silence outside is never perfect. In the lanes you hear a muffled cartwheel, or the bark of a dog. The watchman calls out the hour again, stamping his staff for authority. Inside you think about lighting another candle, but wax is dear and you're half blind anyway, so you lean instead into the flicker of the embers. These hours had a certain intimacy. Couples often whispered together, sharing confessions or plans that daylight might judge too harshly. It was a time when secrets felt safe, wrapped in darkness. Imagine overhearing two voices at the far end of the bed, hushed but urgent, discussing debts or marriages or perhaps gossip about the neighbor's scandalous behavior. You stifle a laugh. Nighttime gossip always carries a thrill, even when the topics are absurd. And yes, sometimes mischief crept in. The interval gave the young and restless an excuse to slip outside, meeting lovers, stealing apples, or just wandering because the night had a magic all its own. If anyone caught you, you could shrug and say, "I'd woken from my first sleep." Perfect alibi. In scholarly texts, physicians recommended gentle activity at this stage, not too much exertion lest the body overheat. They believed the gap allowed the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, to rebalance before second sleep carried you toward dawn. To a modern ear, that sounds like pseudoscience, but oddly enough, modern chronobiology suggests that the body does shift into a naturally wakeful phase after several hours of sleep. Elizabethans might have dressed it in humors and superstition, but their lived experience wasn't so far off from modern experiments. Now, leaning back, you sip a little watered ale, the cool liquid easing your dry throat. Alcohol at midnight? Sure, why not? It's safer than the well water that might kill you faster than any witch's curse. You smirk at the thought. Imagine telling your doctor today that you swig beer at 2 a.m. For health reasons. The fire cracks softly. Shadows crawl up the rough plaster walls. You feel the pull of sleep returning, subtle but irresistible like the tide turning. This between-sleep interlude has served its purpose. Time for prayer, chatter, snacks, and maybe just the gentle reminder that life is not a straight line but a cycle, even in something as ordinary as rest. So you shuffle back toward the bed, the wool blanket calling. Your body sighs as you slip beneath it, limbs heavy, mind calmer. First sleep is behind you. The waking hours are fading and second sleep waits, ready to carry you into dawn. You sink back into the mattress, pulling the blanket tight around your shoulders, and the scratchy wool feels almost comforting after the little excursion by the hearth. The embers glow faintly, enough to make shadows on the ceiling beams, and the room smells of smoke, sweat, and straw. Your body knows what comes next without your mind needing to argue about it. You are easing into the second sleep. This second stretch was different from the first. If the first sleep was heavy, bodily restorative, then the second was gentler, almost dreamier. Elizabethans often described it as lighter, filled with more vivid dreams and more interruptions. It was the part of the night when thoughts became strange, when visions carried meaning, and when people sometimes claimed to hear whispers from the other world. You lie still, eyes closing, and you feel yourself sliding into that thinner, more fragile layer of rest. The mainstream fact here is simple. Medical writers of the day openly recommended this double sleep. In 16th century treatises, physicians advised people to go to bed early. Rest for several hours, rise for a little while, and then return to bed for the second, softer phase until dawn. They insisted it was healthiest for digestion, circulation, and even mood. They may not have known about circadian rhythms, but they wrote with confidence, as if nature itself had given the blueprint. But the quirky detail is that people sometimes scheduled business during these hours. Letters survive describing lawyers, priests, even commoners who woke after first sleep, talked with others and settled disputes or agreements before crawling back to bed. Imagine being summoned at 1:30 a.m. to talk about a loan or a fence dispute, half the neighborhood yawning, while someone waves a candle and says, "We'll finish this before second sleep." Historians still argue whether the second sleep was truly universal, or if it was more common among Northern European households, where winters stretched long and nights dragged on endlessly. In southern regions where daylight lingered longer, perhaps the rhythm was less pronounced. Some even debate whether urban noise bells and taverns extended the wakeful interval, while rural cottages may have drifted into a simpler, longer slumber. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, culture and geography weaving together to form one peculiar pattern. You shift in bed. The wooden frame creaks like an old ship at harbor. A sibling beside you snores softly, rhythmic as a lullaby, while a servant at the foot of the bed curls tighter against the cold. Everyone, despite their different stations, seems to be folded into the same shared rhythm. First sleep, waking interval, second sleep. You realize how collective rest once was, how much it belonged not to individuals, but to households, even entire communities. Dreams drift in more vividly during the second sleep. You might dream of fields, animals, or distant relatives, visions so striking that you would recount them at breakfast, searching for omens. A rooster crowing in the yard might thread itself into your dream as a heavenly trumpet, or a draft from the window could become the chilling breath of some spirit. You know none of it is real, but you also know how real it feels when you're inside it. And yes, superstitions crept in. If you dreamed of water during second sleep, it might mean tears or troubles ahead. If you dreamed of fire, it could mean passion or danger. People bought or borrowed dream manuals, small pamphlets sold cheaply, promising to decode every vision. They weren't accurate, but they gave comfort, much as today's horoscopes offer reassurance wrapped in vagueness. The soundscape of this second sleep is oddly soothing. Bells from the parish tower mark the early morning hours. Carts rattle in the distance as bakers or farmers rise before dawn. Sometimes the voices of animals, roosters, cows, dogs blend with your half-dreams. Instead of keeping you awake, these sounds weave themselves into the experience, part lullaby, part background noise. You realize that absolute silence was rare, and maybe not even desirable. As your body settles deeper, you feel the rhythm of breath, the warmth of shared blankets, and the knowledge that soon daylight will cut through the shutters. For now, though, you are safe in this liminal state. Second sleep wrapping around you like a softer, stranger blanket. You know it won't last forever, but that's the point. It carries you forward gently until morning finally arrives, and just before you slip away, a half-formed thought flickers. Isn't it strange that people once trusted the night to be broken in two, and that today we panic if we wake for even 20 minutes? Perhaps they were wiser than we give them credit for. You wake once more, this time not because the fire has gone out or a sibling elbowed you in the ribs, but because dawn is beginning to whisper through the shutters. The second sleep is ending, and with it comes the question that nags at you. Why did people ever settle into this odd two-part pattern at all? You sit up, rub your eyes, and let yourself drift back through time, tracing the roots of this strange nightly rhythm. The simplest explanation begins with nature itself. In a world without electric light, the human body yielded to the sun and moon. Long winter nights stretched for 14 hours in northern Europe. Imagine trying to sleep 14 hours straight every night on a lumpy straw mattress with 3 relatives beside you. Not going to happen. So instead, people split their rest, falling asleep soon after dusk, rising around midnight and then sleeping again until dawn. This gave them time to tend fires, check livestock, and squeeze in prayer or conversation. The mainstream fact here is that textual evidence for segmented sleep stretches back even earlier than Elizabethan times. Medieval manuscripts describe first sleep and second sleep as far back as the 13th century, showing that the pattern wasn't a quirky fad of one century, but a long-standing habit of European households. You can almost hear the monks scratching lines in their manuscripts, noting the rhythm as casually as if they were describing the weather. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some anthropologists argue that the roots of biphasic sleep go back not just centuries but millennia. Pre-industrial societies in Africa and South America, even in the modern day, have been observed to rest in two phases, especially during long nights. So it might not just be medieval culture. It might be something your body still carries deep in its wiring, like a forgotten default setting. Historians still argue whether the Elizabethans saw this pattern as a deliberate system or just the way things happened naturally. Did they think in terms of two halves of the night, or did they simply accept that sometimes you were awake in the middle? The surviving documents suggest both, some people naming first sleep like it was a calendar event, others mentioning it offhand like shrugging at the rain. You stretch and imagine yourself back in that smoky bedchamber, wondering if perhaps you'd have welcomed the rhythm. After all, those waking hours gave people space for reflection and pause, something modern nights rarely allow. Today you might doom scroll or raid the fridge at 3 a.m. and panic about being awake. In Elizabethan England, you'd be calmly expected to rise, pray, chat, and then tuck back in. No shame, no insomnia panic, just part of life. Consider, too, how religion played into this. The Catholic Church had long divided the day and night into canonical hours, marked by prayer. Midnight prayers, matins, were a standard part of monastic life. Ordinary households may have unconsciously mirrored this sacred rhythm, turning the night into two halves with a holy pause in between. You picture yourself sitting on a wooden stool, clutching a psalter, lips moving in the dim light as the rest of the family mumbles along. The dog curls by the fire, the wind moans against the shutters, and the household is both awake and asleep, both worldly and spiritual. That's the liminal magic of it, the between time, and it wasn't just piety. Farmers used the gap to check on animals. Merchants sometimes plotted journeys. Mothers nursed babies. Couples whispered of tomorrow's plans. The pause wasn't wasted. It was functional. Yet the more you think about it, the more peculiar it seems that this entire pattern has nearly vanished. Modern life insists on a single unbroken sleep, enforced by factory whistles, electric lamps and alarm clocks. You wonder if we've bullied ourselves into ignoring a rhythm that once felt natural. As the second sleep fades and the morning light brightens, you realize that for centuries, this was simply how people lived. Not because of choice, not because of medical advice, but because the night was long, the firewood scarce, and human bodies always leaned toward rhythm. Two sleeps, first heavy, then light, woven through with a wakeful seam in the middle. And so, as you stretch, the question lingers like the smell of smoke in your hair. Maybe the oddest part of Elizabethan sleep isn't that they did it differently, but that you've forgotten how. You rub your arms against the chill, blinking as the pale morning light begins to break across the chamber's rough plaster walls. But before you let yourself drift into the day, you pause and think about what really shaped this two-sleep rhythm. Sure, the body has its own cycles, but the Elizabethans didn't live in a vacuum. Their environment nudged them along. Candles, curfews, and a world swaddled in darkness. Candles, for starters, were precious. A single beeswax candle cost more than a day's wages for many laborers. Most households settled for cheaper tallow candles, made from animal fat, which smoked, smelled unpleasant, and sputtered unpredictably. You light one, and within minutes your chamber smells faintly like roasted mutton. It's enough to illuminate a prayer book or a playing board, but you'd think twice about burning it all night. Better to snuff it out after supper and climb into bed, trusting that the first sleep will come quickly. Then there were curfews, literally bells rung to mark when fires must be dampened and households quieted. The word itself comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. Once the bell tolled, you were expected to settle indoors, bank the hearth, and let the streets fall dark. So if you're imagining Elizabethan towns buzzing with nightlife until dawn, erase that. Unless you were in a tavern, a brothel, or very up to no good, you'd be home wrapped in a blanket staring at shadows. And oh, the shadows. Elizabethan nights were astonishingly dark by modern standards. No street lamps, no neon glow, no reassuring LEDs on appliances. If the moon hid behind clouds, you could barely see your hand in front of your face. Walking a lane at midnight was like stepping into ink, which meant that sleep, or at least retreat to bed, was not just natural but safe. Why risk twisting an ankle in a ditch, or bumping into thieves when you could lie under your covers until morning? The mainstream fact here is that artificial light was so scarce and costly that people's waking hours naturally shrank in winter. Diaries and records show families rising with the sun and winding down shortly after dark. Lighting a room with a few tallow dips was possible, but doing so night after night would burn a hole in your purse. Night was for sleeping, full stop. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some wealthier Elizabethans experimented with ingenious lighting tricks. They used rushlights, thin reeds dipped in fat that burned faster but cheaper than candles. Others set mirrors behind flames to reflect more glow. One extravagant noble even employed servants to feed the fire through the night, so his bedchamber never dimmed. Imagine flexing that luxury. Yes, my fire never dies. A bit less impressive when you realize it probably choked him with smoke by dawn. Historians still argue whether curfews and darkness created the segmented sleep pattern or merely reinforced it. Some suggest people might have split their sleep regardless, since the human body seems to fall into that rhythm naturally. Others insist the enforced early bedtimes practically guaranteed you'd wake before dawn, staring into the gloom with nothing to do but mutter prayers or poke at the hearth. You picture yourself lying under coarse blankets, candle stub snuffed, chamber pitch black. Outside, the town watchman patrols with a lantern, his footsteps echoing, his call of all's well bouncing down narrow lanes. The curfew bell is long past, so no one stirs in the street except the occasional cat or drunkard wobbling home. The silence feels enormous, pressing against your ears. In that hush, it's no wonder your body allows itself to wake halfway through the night. The darkness is endless. Why not break it in two? The next morning you would rise with the sun, stretch your arms and laugh at the idea of staying up until midnight the way modern people do. What on earth would you do with all that candlelight? You might ask, completely serious. And your neighbors would agree. Staying awake after curfew for frivolity would be both wasteful and suspicious. Better to tuck into two neat bundles of sleep, letting the night roll out in its long dark tide. As you imagine closing your eyes again, you realize the irony. Today, people brag about staying up late, illuminated by phones and screens, while Elizabethans might have bragged about how efficiently they saved wax and wood. Different centuries, same obsession with outdoing each other, just with very different bills to pay. You pull the blanket up to your chin and feel the lumpy mattress beneath you shift and creak. It isn't exactly a cloud of comfort, more like a reluctant donkey, serviceable but a bit stubborn about giving you rest. Elizabethan beds and bedding were their own odd world, and as you lie here, you can't help but notice how different your nightly experience would be compared to your memory foam future. Beds themselves were a kind of status symbol. A wealthy household might boast a massive four-poster bed, carved from oak, with heavy curtains to keep out drafts and prying eyes. These beds were so prized that they were sometimes listed in wills, passed down like heirlooms. You imagine inheriting your grandmother's bed, stained, squeaky, and with 2 centuries of snores soaked into the wood. Lucky you. Most households, though, made do with simpler frames. Ropes crisscrossed the wooden base to hold a mattress. And here's your mainstream fact. This is where the phrase "sleep tight" comes from. The ropes needed tightening regularly, or else the mattress sagged like a hammock, dropping you into the middle with everyone else. And remember, beds were often shared, so slack ropes meant elbows, knees, and an unwelcome sense of intimacy. The mattress itself might be stuffed with straw, reeds or chaff, the leftovers from the harvest. If you were lucky, feathers padded the mix, though feathers had their own problems. They poked through the ticking, quills scratching your skin in the night, and they didn't exactly smell like lavender. Quirky detail. Some poorer households stuffed their mattresses with pea pods or even dried leaves. Imagine rolling over and feeling like you're sleeping in a crunchy salad. Blankets and sheets weren't standardized either. Wool was common, sometimes heavy enough to pin you like a stone slab. Linen sheets, if you had them, were washed infrequently, since laundering required boiling water, lye, and hours of back-breaking scrubbing. People often slept in their shifts, the long undergarments they wore by day, partly to keep the sheets cleaner. Of course, cleaner is relative when you only wash them a handful of times a year. Historians still argue whether Elizabethans found their beds cozy or simply endured them. Some diaries describe nights of relative comfort, while others complain of vermin. Yes, vermin. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in straw mattresses, and once you had them, they were nearly impossible to evict. You can imagine scratching yourself raw at 2 a.m., muttering curses, while your neighbor insists his bed is perfectly fine. But for all their faults, beds were central to life. Families gathered in them not just for sleep, but for storytelling, gossip, even business. In winter, the bed was the warmest place in the house, so why not linger? People played cards, mended clothes, or even negotiated contracts while propped up against bolsters. That's right. Your Elizabethan equivalent of a Zoom meeting might happen while everyone was still under the covers. You turn on your side, blanket pulled high, and feel how little privacy a bed offered. If you were poor, several family members, maybe even servants, would cram into the same frame. If you were wealthy, the bedchamber was still semi-public. Servants came and went, courtiers visited, and important announcements could be made bedside. Births, deaths, marriages, many unfolded within arm's reach of the same sagging ropes and lumpy straw, and through it all, the expectation of 2 sleeps remained steady. First sleep, then the wakeful interval, then second sleep. The bed didn't need to be luxurious. It just needed to hold you through both phases. Rattling ropes, vermin, and all, you sigh, scratch an imaginary flea bite, and realize that maybe memory foam isn't such a decadent invention after all. The Elizabethans might have raised eyebrows at your soft, sanitized mattress, but after one night on theirs, you'd probably trade all your candle wax just to sleep without squeaks, scratches and straw poking through the seams. You roll over on the creaking ropes of your borrowed Elizabethan bed and realize you're not alone, not by a long shot. In this world, privacy is practically a myth. The chamber is crowded, not just with family, but with servants too, all lumped together under blankets or curled against the wall. You'd like to think of a bed as your personal fortress, but here it's closer to a community hall made of straw and wool. In most households, the entire family often slept in one room, sometimes in one bed. Parents, children, and servants piled together, layered like lasagna, with dogs or cats tucked in wherever they found space. Imagine waking up to your servant's foot pressed against your shin, your sibling muttering dreams into your ear, and a hound snoring directly onto your chest. Cozy? Maybe romantic? Absolutely not. The mainstream fact is that this arrangement wasn't unusual at all. Contemporary sources describe it plainly. Beds shared by 3, 4, sometimes more bodies. In smaller homes, everyone squeezed into the loft or single heated room, because fires were expensive to maintain and drafts could chill a body straight into sickness. A single hearth warmed them all, so everyone stuck close. But here's a quirky tidbit. Travelers sometimes complained about the shock of sharing beds with total strangers at inns. Imagine stumbling into a roadside tavern, exhausted from a muddy ride, only to be told you'll be snuggling a peddler and his goose tonight. Yes, bed sharing wasn't limited to family. Strangers too might be tucked together if space was short. The records are filled with comical and sometimes awkward complaints about elbows, snores, and worse. Historians still argue whether Elizabethans minded this lack of privacy or if they barely noticed it. Was it simply too normal to complain? Did they secretly yearn for solitude? Or was closeness comforting in a cold, uncertain world? Diaries are curiously quiet on the subject, perhaps because everyone assumed the arrangement was as inevitable as rain. You picture yourself wedged between a sibling and a servant, blanket pulled over your nose to block the smell of unwashed feet. The chamber air is heavy with breath, smoke, and the musky tang of damp wool. In the corner, a servant mutters prayers before nodding off again. A child stirs and whimpers, soothed by a parent's absent-minded pat. Nobody apologizes. Nobody pretends this is strange. It's just life. During the interval between sleeps, this shared space could grow lively. Someone stoked the fire. Another whispered gossip. A servant slipped out to fetch water. Even in the middle of the night, the room hummed like a hive. Imagine trying to drift into a solitary, meditative calm with 6 other bodies shifting and sighing around you. It would feel less like mindfulness and more like surviving a sleepover that never ends. And yet, there's comfort here too. The body heat of so many sleepers turns the bed into a furnace, holding off the icy draft from poorly sealed shutters. The shared murmurs at midnight create an intimacy that modern isolation lacks. You might grumble about a sibling's snore, but when wolves howl in the distance, or rumors of witches flicker through the town, being alone in the dark would feel far worse. Wealthier households, of course, had larger beds in separate chambers, but even then, servants often slept nearby, on pallets or benches within the same room. Privacy was reserved for the truly powerful, and even then only occasionally. For everyone else, sleep was communal. You glance across the crowded room, catching the glint of a half-burnt candle, the shuffle of someone resettling their blanket, and you realize that in this era, the night belonged to groups, not individuals. Sleep was never just yours. It was shared, messy, noisy, and profoundly human. You shift under the heavy wool blanket, trying to carve out just a little personal space among the jumble of limbs and sighs. But the room is stirring again, not with the chaos of morning, but with something softer, almost reverent. This is the time between sleeps when prayer and ritual take center stage. You sit up, the chill biting at your skin, and notice how naturally the atmosphere shifts into one of devotion. Elizabethan nights often included whispered psalms, murmured prayers, or readings from scripture. Families used this waking interval to speak to God, believing the hours after first sleep carried special weight. The silence of midnight felt like holy ground, as if heaven were closer when the world itself was hushed. You picture yourself kneeling by the bed, lips moving through the familiar words, while the fire throws faint red light on bowed heads. The mainstream fact is that religious texts of the era encouraged such habits. Clergymen recommended nighttime prayers as ideal moments to purify the soul, confess sins, or petition for protection until dawn. In a society where death, illness, and uncertainty loomed daily, these prayers weren't just routine. They were insurance policies for the soul. The quirky tidbit? Some manuals suggested very specific prayers for the gap between sleeps. For example, certain psalms were thought especially powerful against nightmares or demonic visitations. One pamphlet advised repeating a verse while sprinkling holy water near the bed, just in case wandering spirits tried to slip under the covers. Imagine dousing your blanket before crawling back in, whispering, "No ghosts tonight. Thank you very much." Historians still argue whether everyone participated in these midnight rituals, or if the practice was stronger among the devout. Diaries suggest that many families treated the time casually, filling it with both prayer and chatter. For some, it may have been more about practical tasks, tending to the fire or fetching food, than kneeling in reverence. The truth likely sat somewhere in between, the holy and the ordinary braided together. You glance around the chamber. One person mutters prayers under their breath, crossing themselves before lying back down. Another uses the time to mend a torn sleeve by firelight, muttering curses instead of scripture. A child sleepily repeats the Lord's Prayer, mixing words until it trails off into a yawn. The line between devotion and distraction blurs, but somehow that's what makes it human. Prayer manuals weren't the only influence. Folk rituals often slipped into the mix. Some families recited charms against witches or muttered words over a sick child, hoping the in-between hours held special power. Midnight was liminal, a seam between two halves of sleep, and in that seam people believed the veil between worlds was thinner. Whether you whispered scripture or superstition, the intention was the same: to make it safely into the second sleep. You imagine yourself returning to the bed, blanket rough against your chin, comforted by the faint murmur of psalms in the background. The cadence is steady, rhythmic, like a lullaby designed for souls as much as bodies. Outside, the parish bell tolls the hour, reminding you that dawn is still distant. Yet here in the chamber, faith fills the darkness. And even if your modern brain might chuckle at sprinkling holy water on your sheets, you can't deny the appeal of the ritual. In a night stretched long and uncertain, those whispered words offered focus, comfort, and maybe even the courage to fall back into fragile dreams. The prayers taper off, a last whispered amen dissolving into the smoky air. Now the chamber shifts again, this time into something lighter, half playful, half conspiratorial. Between first and second sleep, people didn't just kneel in devotion. They also leaned in close to gossip, played quiet games, or indulged in small mischief that daylight might frown upon. You're still awake, after all, and the dark feels like permission to stretch the rules. Picture yourself by the hearth. The embers pulse red, painting shadows on the walls. A few family members huddle close, their voices lowered to keep from waking children or elders. They exchange rumors: who argued at market, who sneaked into whose garden, which neighbor was suspected of watering down his ale. In a world without newspapers for common folk, gossip was the midnight newsfeed. You lean in, trying not to laugh, realizing that nothing has changed, only the medium. They whispered at the fire. You scroll Twitter at 2 a.m. Here's your mainstream fact. Historical records show that people really did socialize during these hours. Letters, diaries, and even court depositions mention conversations, card games, and whispered storytelling in the middle of the night. This wasn't insomnia. It was routine. People expected to chat and share while waiting for the second sleep. The quirky tidbit is that these hours sometimes hosted secret trysts. Court records from Elizabethan and Jacobean times occasionally note that illicit meetings happened after the first sleep, when households dozed again and lovers could slip out unseen. Imagine sneaking barefoot across creaking floorboards, hoping the dog doesn't bark, to meet someone in the yard at 1 in the morning. Romantic, maybe. Risky? Absolutely. Especially if your blanket-thieving sibling decides to rat you out later. Historians still argue whether this social interlude was more important in towns, where neighbors lived cheek by jowl, or in the countryside, where farms spread farther apart. Some suggest the waking period gave rural families a chance to tend animals or check fields, while urban households used it more for talk, games, or sneaky mischief. Either way, the evidence points to a cultural rhythm that mixed piety, practicality, and play. Back by the hearth, someone pulls out a small board, scattering pebbles to play a counting game. Another deals cards, worn and greasy from use. Laughter stays hushed, more chuckle than roar, but it threads through the quiet like warmth. You reach for a hunk of bread, chew slowly and nod at the absurdity of eating, praying, and gaming, all in the same span between sleeps. Outside, the night continues its own rhythm. A dog barks in the lane, answered by another across town. The watchman calls the hour again, his voice tired but dutiful. You smirk at the thought. Even he might lean on gossip to stay awake. Perhaps he too whispers jokes with a fellow guard, stamping feet against the cold while waiting for dawn. And yes, mischief always lurked. Teenagers, or their Elizabethan equivalents, might slip outside to meet friends, to drink, to wander. The dark gave cover, and the interval between sleeps gave timing. You can almost see them, cloaks pulled tight, dashing through lanes with barely stifled laughter, hoping their parents still believed them asleep. You lean back, belly warmed by bread and ale, and let the laughter of the room fade into a softer hum. This too is part of the cycle. First sleep, then prayer, gossip, play, and eventually the pull of second sleep. The household might be small, the chamber smoky, the blankets scratchy, but somehow the night feels rich, an unfolding story in 2 acts, with a social intermission in between. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you realize that maybe the best part of Elizabethan nights wasn't the rest at all, but the permission to live fully in the middle of them. You let your head rest back against the bolster, the fire's glow painting the underside of the bed curtains, and you think about the people who love to explain all this, the physicians. In Elizabethan England, medicine wasn't just about leeches and herbs. It was also about telling you how to live every hour of your day, night included. Doctors wrote confidently about sleep, as if it were as controllable as diet or exercise, and they had very particular opinions about why your night should come in 2 halves. The mainstream fact is this: medical treatises from the 16th century often recommended biphasic sleep. Physicians believed the body needed an early slumber to process food and calm the vapors of digestion. After 3 or 4 hours, they said, it was healthy to rise, walk a little, relieve yourself, perhaps pray, and then return for a second, lighter sleep to carry you toward morning. They framed this as balance, keeping the 4 humors aligned so that blood didn't overheat, phlegm didn't stagnate, and bile didn't wander into trouble. One quirky tidbit? Some physicians argued that reading in the middle of the night was excellent for the mind. They claimed the brain, rested from first sleep, was sharper and more receptive to wisdom. Of course, they also warned not to overdo it, lest too much candlelight or concentration inflame the eyes or cause headaches. You imagine your doctor today prescribing: wake at midnight, read 2 Psalms and a chapter of Cicero, then back to bed. Insurance definitely wouldn't cover it. Historians still argue whether physicians were reflecting a widespread custom or actively shaping it. Did people sleep in 2 shifts because that's what felt natural? Or because doctors kept writing that it was healthiest? Perhaps both. Culture and biology looped around each other, each reinforcing the habit until nobody questioned it. You imagine paging through a thick, leather-bound medical book by flickering light, its margins filled with recipes for remedies, powders, syrups, and instructions for when to sleep. The physician's voice is confident, almost bossy, telling you to avoid late-night feasting, to air the chamber regularly, to make sure your second sleep isn't too heavy or you'll wake sluggish. It's a reminder that even in bed, you were never entirely free of someone's advice. What strikes you most is how practical some of their suggestions sound. Rising between sleeps to stretch, to move a little, to drink water. Modern sleep specialists sometimes recommend similar things for insomnia. You wonder if, in their fumbling way, Elizabethan doctors had stumbled onto truths that still apply, and yet some of their advice drifts into the absurd. One writer claimed that the interval between sleeps was ideal for bloodletting because the body was warm and circulation lively. Picture yourself stumbling half awake, rolling up a sleeve while a barber surgeon stands ready with a bowl at 1 in the morning. You'd probably prefer to just go back to bed. Still, there's something oddly comforting in the idea that sleep was not just a private habit, but part of medicine, theology, and daily rhythm. When you rose in the middle of the night, you weren't breaking a rule. You were following it. Doctors themselves said so. Now, as you shift deeper into the bed, the mattress squeaking, you wonder whether we've lost something in ignoring this advice. Modern life demands 8 uninterrupted hours, yet here's history whispering that maybe the body was always meant to dance in 2 steps. Your eyes drift shut. The last thing you hear is that imaginary physician wagging his finger, reminding you not to oversleep your second shift or risk melancholic humors. You smile faintly, comforted by the idea that even your 3 a.m. tossing and turning could be rebranded as doctor approved. The chamber grows still again, though you sense the quiet is filled with many layers of meaning. Not every Elizabethan experienced the night in quite the same way. Social class shaped everything, from the food on your table to the weight of your blankets, and it also shaped how you moved through first and second sleep. Tonight you imagine drifting between the lives of peasants, merchants, and nobles, watching how each group's rhythms unfolded after dark. For the peasant family, life was dictated by labor. You see them in a one-room cottage, smoke-blackened rafters overhead, the smell of livestock seeping through from the adjoining shed. After sundown, they collapse on straw mattresses or wooden pallets, exhausted from tilling, sowing, and hauling. Their first sleep is heavy and dreamless, broken only when a child cries or the embers need tending. During the wakeful interval, they might mend tools by the fire, pray for a better harvest, or sip thin ale to warm their bellies. Their second sleep carries them until dawn, when the cock crows and duty calls again. Privacy is non-existent. Survival, not comfort, is the goal. Merchants lived differently. Picture a narrow London townhouse, timber beams jutting at odd angles, with multiple rooms but little more warmth. Here, the interval between sleeps might be used for writing letters of credit, balancing accounts, or discussing business with family. By candlelight, a merchant might draft a note to a partner in Antwerp or jot down cargo lists for tomorrow's shipment. Between yawns, his wife might plan purchases for the household, while children whisper gossip or sneak nibbles from the pantry. Their second sleep is lighter, troubled sometimes by worries about debt or trade winds. Then there are the nobles with their curtained four-posters, feather mattresses, and chambers large enough to echo. The mainstream fact is that wealthy families often treated the waking interval as a social space. Courtiers wrote of nighttime conversations, poetry, even music performed in bedchambers, while others half dozed. It wasn't unusual for servants to be summoned to fetch wine or read aloud. Imagine yourself in velvet sheets, sipping spiced claret at 1 a.m. while someone recites sonnets. Luxurious, but also faintly ridiculous when you think of your neighbors shivering in straw. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some noble households staged masques or impromptu entertainments that spilled into the small hours, effectively stretching the first sleep into a nap and replacing the interval with revelry. It blurred the line between the two-sleep system and all-night carousing. Of course, the physicians would have frowned. insisting the humours were being dangerously jostled by such excess. Historians still argue whether these differences between classes were as stark in practice as they sound on paper. Were nobles really enjoying midnight poetry while peasants patched hose? Or did all families, regardless of wealth, share the same basic rhythm of rest, bound by long nights and weak lighting? The truth may be more nuanced, with culture bending slightly at each social tier but anchored by the same natural cycle. You glance around the imagined chambers. In the peasant cottage, second sleep is squeezed in tightly. Bodies huddled against the cold, dreams filled with work waiting at dawn. In the merchant's townhouse, second sleep is edged with anxieties about trade and reputation. In the noble's great bed, second sleep may be softer, layered in silks, but no less fragile. Dreams interrupted by politics, ambition, or the fear of losing favor at court, and so, regardless of wealth, all Elizabethans returned to bed. Slipping back into the second half of the night, the rope beds sag, the straw shifts, the curtains sway in the draught, but sleep enfolds them all, rich and poor alike. The night is democratic in that way. Everyone gets two turns, whether on pea pods or on goose down. As you close your own eyes again, you can't help but laugh softly at the idea. Peasants, merchants, nobles, all tossing in the dark together, joined not by wealth or power, but by the same shared rhythm of the night. The night deepens, and though you've nestled back under your blanket, you can't help but notice the chill creeping in. Cold was one of the defining features of an Elizabethan night. Houses, especially in winter, were hard to heat, and second sleep often unfolded beneath the shiver of icy air. You pull the blanket tighter and it does its best, but really the household fought cold with more than just cloth. They fought it with curtains. Beds, especially those of the wealthier, often came fitted with heavy drapes, hanging like walls from the four-poster frame. When drawn shut, they trapped warmth, creating a microclimate inside the bed. Imagine crawling in, pulling thick curtains around you, and suddenly finding the air a few degrees warmer, your own body heat amplified. It's a cocoon against the drafts whistling through cracks in wooden shutters. The mainstream fact is that Elizabethan houses were notoriously cold. Stone walls and timber frames leaked heat, and fires provided warmth only in the immediate circle around them. Most rooms had no fireplaces at all, leaving bed curtains as the most reliable defense against frost. People even hung tapestries along walls to block drafts, a detail noted in inventories of noble households. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some beds were so well curtained and layered that they became breeding grounds for mustiness and worse. Insects thrived in the warmth, and stale air collected inside, making some sleepers complain of headaches. Imagine fumbling out of your bed curtain cocoon at 3 a.m., gasping for fresh air, only to find it's below freezing outside. Suddenly, the musty cocoon doesn't seem so bad. Historians still argue whether the average Elizabethan home was truly as frigid as often described. Some suggest that body heat, shared spaces, and constant fire tending made homes cozier than modern imagination allows. Others insist the drafts were brutal, pointing to frequent complaints of colds, agues, and winter fevers. Either way, Elizabethan nights were battles between human warmth and the elements. You picture yourself sliding the curtains closed, the fabric brushing your face, muffling the outside world. Inside, it's a tent of sorts, intimate and close. The fire's glow beyond the drapes dims to an orange haze, but you feel safer, warmer. The cold lingers, though, pressing against your toes, creeping through the straw mattress beneath. You tuck your feet into the crook of another sleeper's knees. Unromantic, perhaps, but practical. Blankets were layered thick, often wool on wool, heavy enough that you could hardly roll over without effort. In poorer homes, cloaks and spare clothing were piled on top to add weight. In wealthier houses, Fur throws sometimes covered the bed, though these luxury pelts carried their own musky scents. You laugh quietly at the thought of suffocating under a mountain of wool, while your modern self grumbles about a slightly overwarm duvet. And then there's the fire. Someone has stirred it back to life during the interval, feeding it with logs or peat. But fires are greedy. They smoke, they spit sparks, they threaten to go out the moment you look away. The glow reaches your bed but never fully warms it. You realize now why curtains mattered so much. They weren't decoration but survival. Still, cold shaped more than comfort. It shaped schedules. People went to bed earlier in winter because there was little else to do in a freezing, dark house. They rose later too, burrowed deep into second sleep, reluctant to face the frost. Cold framed the entire rhythm of Elizabethan nights, pressing people closer together, binding families under heavy blankets, and encouraging the very pattern of two sleeps. You snuggle down, imagining the icy drafts rattling the shutters, the muffled whistle of wind in the chimney, and the satisfying security of fabric walls drawn around you. It isn't luxury in the modern sense, but for Elizabethans, warmth itself was wealth. The bed curtains block some of the cold, but they can't shut out the sounds of the night. Elizabethan towns and villages rarely slept in silence. As you shift under the blankets, you catch the echo of a church bell marking the hour, the clatter of a cartwheel in the distance, or the bark of a restless dog. Sleep in two parts wasn't just about the body. It was also shaped by the noisy, watchful world outside. The mainstream fact is that many towns employed night watchmen. These men patrolled the streets carrying lanterns and staves, announcing the hours with cries like "past 1 o'clock and all's well." Their job was part security, part reassurance, and part nuisance. You imagine dozing peacefully, only to be startled awake by a booming voice under your window, reminding you it's 2 a.m. The Elizabethan version of a car alarm, only with less chance of being ignored. Here's a quirky tidbit. Watchmen were notorious for dozing off, drinking, or even joining the very criminals they were meant to deter. Satirical ballads poked fun at them, calling them more likely to trip over their own staffs than catch a thief. Some households even complained that the racket of watchmen kept them awake more than burglars ever did. You can picture one leaning against a wall snoring, while rats scurry past with more discipline than he has. Historians still argue whether the noise of bells, watchmen and taverns helped normalize segmented sleep. Did people wake naturally, or because the environment kept nudging them out of slumber? It's impossible to measure, but the blend of human and environmental rhythms likely made midnight waking less a personal quirk and more a cultural inevitability. Beyond the human noise came the bells. Parish churches rang to mark canonical hours, sometimes even in the dead of night. Midnight prayers in monasteries bled into town life, reminding ordinary folk of sacred time. Imagine lying in bed half awake, hearing the deep toll of a bell rolling through the darkness. To some, it was holy reassurance. To others, it was just one more reason to grumble into the pillow. And the streets themselves carried sound. In London, carts rattled in early hours as bakers began their work. In spilled laughter and drunken songs late into the night. In villages, animals stirred, roosters crowing too early, dogs barking at unseen shapes, pigs snuffling restlessly in pens. For you, lying under the covers, the noise becomes part of the night's rhythm, folding itself into your dreams or nudging you back into that in-between state between sleeps. Inside, households added their own chorus. Snores, coughs, shifting limbs, and whispered conversations filled chambers where multiple sleepers shared space. With so many bodies, true silence was impossible. Privacy was rare and sound traveled freely. The Elizabethan night was not quiet, it was alive. You lie there, half listening, half drowsing as the noises blend together. The measured call of the watchman, the low toll of the bell, the distant bark of a dog. It's not peace in the modern sense, but it is familiar, expected, woven into the very fabric of segmented sleep. And just before you drift into second sleep again, you smirk at the thought. In your world, it's the hum of the fridge, the whir of traffic, the neighbor's TV. In theirs, it was bells, dogs, and drunken watchmen. Different centuries, same problem. Someone is always keeping you awake. You roll over and pull the blankets tighter, half asleep, half aware that the noises outside the chamber have slipped into something stranger. In this second sleep, dreams arrive more vividly, tugging at your mind with images that feel both nonsensical and significant. Elizabethans didn't dismiss dreams the way many do today. To them, dreams were messages, warnings, even glimpses of divine will. You lie still, drifting in that liminal space, wondering what your midnight visions might mean. The mainstream fact is that dream interpretation was a common pastime. People owned dream manuals, cheap little books that translated images into predictions. Dream of a fish, it might mean fortune. Dream of teeth falling out, a death could be near. Dream of flying, perhaps prosperity or a divine blessing. These manuals were sold widely, blending folklore, astrology, and theology into bite-sized prophecies. Imagine flipping through one while sipping ale at breakfast, nodding seriously as your neighbor recounts his vision of cows dancing in the lane. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some Elizabethans believed that dreams during second sleep were especially potent. Because the body was more rested and the soul less tethered, visions in this phase carried greater authority. A nightmare at 3 a.m. might send a person hurrying to the parish priest for interpretation, or to a cunning woman for charms. You chuckle at the thought of dragging yourself to a healer before dawn, bleary-eyed, insisting, "It was a black dog, Reverend." Does that mean debt or the devil? Historians still argue whether people truly believed every dream carried meaning, or whether many treated dream manuals more like novelty entertainment, Elizabethan horoscopes, essentially. Some evidence suggests deep faith in dreams as divine communication, while other sources hint at a wink and nudge attitude, where people use them as icebreakers or excuses for gossip. You imagine your second sleep dreams now. Perhaps you're walking through a meadow that suddenly floods, or you're seated at a feast where every dish turns to ash. To your modern mind, it's odd nonsense. To an Elizabethan, it could signal bad weather, famine, or betrayal by a friend. Breakfast conversation practically wrote itself when your subconscious did half the work. Dreams also overlapped with religion. The Bible held examples of divine messages delivered through dreams. Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's vision of fat and lean cows, for instance. Elizabethans took such stories as proof that their own dreams might hold cosmic importance. Falling asleep was not merely rest. It was a chance for God to speak. Of course, not all visions were welcome. Nightmares often stirred fears of witchcraft or demonic attack. If you woke sweaty and shaken in second sleep, it might be blamed on an incubus or a spell cast by a jealous neighbor. A charm placed under the pillow, a sprig of rosemary, a silver coin was thought to protect against malicious influences. The chamber is still crowded, the snores and sighs of your bedmates humming in the background. But in second sleep, the line between their noises and your dreamscape blurs. A sibling coughs, and in your dream it becomes a thunderclap. A dog barks outside, and in your vision, wolves appear. The boundary between waking and dreaming thins, making the whole night feel like one long drifting story. You roll over, sighing as the weight of superstition presses close. Whether you laugh it off or clutch it tightly, the Elizabethan habit of treating dreams as guides means that even in sleep, your mind is never entirely at rest. The night is not just for bodies to recover. It is for souls to wander, sending back cryptic postcards in the form of visions. As your second sleep deepens, you realize the irony. For all their fleas, drafts, and crowded beds, Elizabethans might have looked forward to dreams more than to waking. And maybe, when your own alarm jolts you out of a bizarre dream tomorrow morning, you'll wish for just a little of their patience in deciphering it. The chamber is still, but your mind, stirred by those vivid dreams, drifts towards something darker, the superstitions that haunted Elizabethan nights. You shift under the heavy covers and imagine what it felt like to live in a world where the midnight hours were not just inconvenient, they were dangerous. People believed that waking between first and second sleep put you at risk of crossing paths with forces you'd rather avoid. The mainstream fact is that midnight was often considered a spiritually charged time. In sermons and popular belief, the hours around midnight were when demons prowled. Witches worked their spells and spirits slipped closest to the mortal world. The very word witching hour, though coined later, has roots in these beliefs. Elizabethans knew it well. If something sinister was going to creep into your chamber, it would happen when the fire was low and the house half asleep. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some people kept protective charms tucked under their pillows or sewn into their bedclothes, things like dried herbs, iron nails, or scraps of scripture. One particularly odd recipe suggested wearing your shoes to bed, laces tied tight, to confuse any spirits who tried to snatch your soul. The theory was that the demon wouldn't know whether you were leaving or arriving, and would get discouraged. Imagine being elbowed awake by a sibling at 2 a.m. and grumbling, "It's fine. I'm protected. I wore my shoes." Historians still argue whether fear of the supernatural truly dominated everyone's midnight thoughts, or whether only the more anxious clung to these beliefs. After all, some households treated the waking interval as mundane, time for chores, prayers, or gossip, while others infused it with dread. Perhaps superstition varied by region, by class, or simply by temperament. The written records leave enough ambiguity for endless debate. Still, the evidence is clear that many took midnight dangers seriously. Witches were blamed for nightmares, sudden sickness, or restless cattle. Spirits were thought to slip through cracks and chimneys, lured by unguarded households. Even natural phenomena like sleep paralysis, waking with a heavy chest, unable to move, were interpreted as attacks by a night hag. If you've ever jolted awake feeling pinned in place, now imagine explaining it to your Elizabethan neighbors. "A witch sat on me." They'd nod in sympathy and hand you a clove of garlic. The communal nature of beds made superstition even stronger. If one person had a nightmare, the entire room might stir uneasily, whispering prayers, fumbling for charms, or stoking the fire against evil. The darkness outside became a stage for fears. Shadows were spirits, winds were curses, creaks were witches at the door. In truth, the drafty timber and noisy streets explained most of it. But reason rarely competes well with fear at 2 a.m. You picture yourself peeking through the bed curtains, heart racing after a bad dream. A sibling mutters a charm under their breath. Someone scratches a cross into the hearth's ash. The fire crackles as if in agreement. You're not just awake, you're alert to unseen threats. The waking interval is no longer a pause, it's a watch, a vigil. And yet superstition had its strange comforts. Believing that a simple charm or prayer could hold back the night gave people a sense of control in a world of plagues, famine, and uncertainty. Maybe the ritual of sprinkling holy water or placing rosemary at the bedpost helped them drift back into second sleep with a little less dread. You tugged the blanket up again, half amused at the thought of shoes as shields, half chilled by the idea of spirits drifting through the rafters. The night feels longer now, heavier. But then you remind yourself, the watchman is still outside, the bells still toll, and the fire still glows. The darkness may be full of fears, but it is also full of rituals, habits, and quiet bravery. As you let your eyes close, you realize the Elizabethan night was never simply about rest. It was about enduring uncertainty, warding off the unseen, and learning to live with the notion that even sleep might open the door to mystery. The household breathes in unison, yet beyond the curtained bed and smoky rafters, the world outside is wide awake in its own way. Elizabethans didn't just live with human schedules. Animals shaped the rhythm of the night as much as bells and prayers. As you shift in your straw mattress, you hear them. The restless shuffling in the yard, the distant crow of a rooster, the soft lowing of a cow. Their sounds weave into the cycle of first sleep, waking hours, and second sleep, reminding you that you're never alone in the night. The mainstream fact is that farm animals were kept astonishingly close to households. In many poorer cottages, livestock were stabled in adjoining rooms or lean-tos, partly for warmth and partly for safety. Chickens clucked underfoot, pigs rooted nearby, and cows lowed from the other side of a thin wall. At midnight, when you stirred from first sleep, you might hear your animals stirring too, syncing your routine with theirs. Here's a quirky tidbit. Roosters were infamous for crowing too early. Instead of waiting for dawn, they often let loose at midnight, confusing sleepers and prompting grumbles about false dawns. Imagine being shaken awake by a proud rooster, announcing it's time to rise, only to discover you've still got hours of darkness left. It's the Elizabethan version of your phone alarm going off on a Saturday by mistake. Historians still argue whether animals adapted to human sleep cycles or whether humans adapted to theirs. Did families wake between sleeps partly because animals were noisy, or did animals stir because people were moving about? The truth is likely a messy blend. Either way, the household and the barnyard shared the same circadian stage, each feeding into the other's rhythm. You picture yourself slipping outside during the interval, crunching across frosty ground to check the cows. Their breath puffs like steam engines in the cold, their eyes gleaming in the lantern light. Chickens rustle on their perches, feathers shifting. A dog stretches and shakes off slumber, tail wagging faintly. These creatures don't mark the night as holy or sinister. For them, it's practical. Eat, rest, guard, repeat. Yet in their steady patterns, Elizabethans found cues for their own sleep. Some families even used the waking interval to tend animals, milking cows, feeding pigs, checking that nothing had gone wrong in the dark. The idea of squeezing chores into the night might sound exhausting to you, but to them it was efficiency. Better to mend a fence or chase off a fox at midnight than to wake at dawn and discover disaster. Inside the chamber, animal noises filtered in constantly. A dog barked, and someone muttered that spirits must be near. A cow lowed, and a child stirred, convinced it was part of a dream. Roosters, pigs, and even mice became part of the soundscape of Elizabethan sleep. Silence was never truly possible, not in towns, not in cottages, not even in noble estates. And yet there's comfort in it. As you lie beneath the blankets, the soft stamp of hooves outside reassures you that the animals are still alive, still part of your household's fragile survival. Their noise is proof of continuity. And in the strange midnight interval, when humans hover between wakes and dreams, the barnyard joins you in the liminal space. You smirk at the thought. You may worry about insomnia at 3 a.m., but at least you don't have a rooster screaming in your ear, or a cow bellowing through the wall. Elizabethans managed it with patience, or perhaps with a resigned sense of humor. After all, the animals weren't just companions. They were the alarm clocks, heaters, and livelihoods of the household. So you turn on your side, drifting again, lulled by the odd chorus of chickens, dogs, and cattle. The night is no longer just human. It's a choir of creatures, each keeping their own watch until dawn. You settle back beneath the heavy wool and scratchy linen, the barnyard chorus still faint in your ears, when your mind drifts to another layer of Elizabethan life, the endless advice about how you should be sleeping. Because, of course, even in a world without smartphones or alarm clocks, someone was ready to tell you you were doing it wrong. Printed guides, household manuals, and pamphlets were full of recommendations on how to manage the night. The mainstream fact is that the 16th century was an age of manuals, cheaply printed books filled with advice for running households, raising children, and preserving health. Sleep got plenty of attention in these guides. They advised when to go to bed early, how long to sleep, not too much, not too little, and how to use the waking interval wisely. Prayer, reflection, light work. A good householder, one guide insisted, manage their night as carefully as their day. Here's a quirky tidbit. One household manual warned against lying on your left side during first sleep. The reasoning? Doctors believed this position compressed the liver and slowed digestion. Once you turned to second sleep, though, you were supposed to roll onto your right side to let the food settle properly. To imagine being scolded for bad sleeping posture in a century when mattresses were basically sacks of straw. You roll over just to be safe, chuckling at the thought. Historians still argue whether people actually followed this printed advice, or whether manuals were more aspirational than practical. It's easy to picture Elizabethan families buying a guide, nodding solemnly at its wisdom, then ignoring it the moment life got messy. After all, when your toddler screams at midnight or your rooster crows too early, you're not exactly consulting the index for solutions. The manuals weren't only medical, they were moral too. Some advised against excessive chatter during the waking hours, warning that idle gossip invited sin. Others insisted couples use the interval for prayer rather than carnal indulgences, though midwives winked at the fact that many babies were conceived during that very gap. The clash between advice and reality was as old then as it is now. You picture a householder by candlelight, thumbing through a printed guide while others stir from first sleep. The flickering page insists he should meditate on scripture, avoid heavy foods, and roll carefully from left to right. Meanwhile, a child tugs at his sleeve asking for bread. A servant snores loudly, and someone knocks over a jug in the dark. The advice is neat. The reality is chaos. Some manuals even extended to dream interpretation. They offered glossaries of symbols, snakes, rivers, storms with accompanying moral lessons. A dream of gold might mean temptation. A dream of flight could be pride. The printed page became both a spiritual compass and a bedside companion, shaping how people understood their fragmented nights. And yet you realize the very existence of these manuals shows how seriously sleep was taken. It wasn't just a biological necessity, it was a moral, spiritual, and social act. How you slept reflected who you were. A diligent, godly householder kept to the right rhythms, tended to the fire at midnight, prayed earnestly, and returned to bed responsibly. A lazy one overslept, neglected chores, and left the house vulnerable to both thieves and spirits. As you lie back, you smirk at how little has changed. Your own age is full of guides promising perfect sleep in 5 steps, 10 hacks for better dreams, or the billionaire's bedtime routine. Erstwhile, the Elizabethans had their own versions, just printed with ink on rough paper rather than glowing on a screen. You yawn, imagining those earnest pages fluttering in the candlelight, their neat prescriptions always a step behind the messy reality of life. And as you drift towards second sleep once again, you realize the manuals may have been less about rules and more about reassurance, that even in the darkest hours, there was a written voice telling you what to do. You roll onto your side, the mattress ropes creaking beneath you, and let your thoughts wander farther afield. The Elizabethans weren't alone in their two-sleep rhythm. In fact, if you could peer across Europe in this era, you'd see the same pattern flickering in cottages, taverns, and townhouses from Italy to France, from the Low Countries to the far reaches of Scandinavia. This wasn't an English quirk, it was a continent-wide habit. The mainstream fact is that references to first sleep and second sleep appear in documents across Europe. French literature of the 16th century describes premier sommeil with the same casual familiarity as the English term. In Italy, night prayers and midnight activity were common enough that writers recorded them without surprise. Even in rural Germany, villagers spoke of waking after the erste Schlaf. The language varied, but the concept remained steady, a night cut neatly in two. Here's a quirky tidbit. In France, it was fashionable in some circles to use the midnight interval for letter writing. Surviving correspondence shows people dating letters at 1 or 2 in the morning, fully aware their recipients would not be shocked. Imagine the postal service today, receiving stacks of half-asleep midnight ramblings as the norm. "Forgive my errors," one might write. "I composed this after my first sleep." Charming excuse for typos. Historians still argue whether this biphasic pattern was universal across all of Europe, or whether it was strongest in the north, where long winter nights demanded it. Some Mediterranean accounts hint at segmented sleep too, but regions with shorter nights may not have experienced it as intensely. Was the pattern human biology expressed everywhere, or was it magnified by the cold, dark winters of northern Europe? The debate continues, fueled by fragments of letters, diaries, and manuals. Still, enough records exist to paint a clear picture. The two-sleep system was known, practiced, and accepted widely. In some parts of France, doctors even debated whether the waking period should be spent in silence or conversation, as if the body's natural rhythm had sparked an entire etiquette. Italians sometimes used the gap for family councils, gathering in kitchens to talk over wine while embers glowed. In Spain, clerics encouraged faithful Catholics to use the interval for extra prayers, linking the cycle to religious devotion. You imagine yourself traveling across Europe, slipping from one chamber to the next. In a French farmhouse, you find peasants rising to sip watered wine, muttering about the weather. In an Italian townhouse, merchants huddle over account books, calculating profits while children doze again. In a German village, a midwife is summoned between sleeps to attend a birth, her lantern bobbing through snowy lanes. Different languages, different customs, but the rhythm of first and second sleep ties them together. Even inns carried the habit. Travelers reported being offered a bed and assured they'd have time to rise after first sleep for food or drink before settling again. The idea that the night was broken into stages was so accepted that inns and taverns built their routines around it. Imagine stumbling downstairs at midnight to find others already gathered by the fire, mugs in hand, not carousing but simply existing in that shared in-between time. It strikes you that this shared rhythm must have shaped conversation across borders. A letter written in Paris at midnight, a prayer whispered in Florence, a lullaby sung in a London cottage, all belong to the same pulse of the night. Across Europe, millions lived by this pattern, though few would have thought it remarkable enough to explain. You pull the blanket close again, amused that in the one place where people were often divided, religion, politics, even war, They still shared the same nightly script. The segmented sleep of Europe was a quiet, universal chorus, uniting people who might never meet. And as you drift, you realize that for centuries, night across the continent belonged not to silence but to rhythm. First sleep, waking hours, second sleep, from Lisbon to Lübeck. The fire pops in the hearth, but the room is drifting quiet again, which makes you think about those who didn't enjoy the full luxury of 2 complete sleeps. Not every Elizabethan had the freedom to treat the night like a staged performance, divided neatly in halves. Some were on duty, some were traveling, and some were working jobs that demanded they stay awake when everyone else wanted to drift back under the blankets. The mainstream fact is that shift work existed even in the 16th century. Night watchmen, of course, patrolled towns to guard against fire, theft, or wandering drunks. Servants in wealthier households were expected to stoke fires, fetch water, or tend to the needs of masters at odd hours. And bakers. Yes, bakers often rose in the dark to begin kneading dough so that bread would be ready by morning. Their schedule barely allowed for a second sleep. Sometimes their wakeful interval stretched right into the next day's labor. Here's a quirky tidbit. Traveling by coach or horse was often scheduled at night to avoid crowded roads or to make the most of time. That meant travelers caught their rests in awkward fragments, dozing in taverns between first and second sleep, or nodding uncomfortably on benches while others stirred. Imagine clattering down a muddy road at 1 a.m., lantern swinging, driver half asleep, while you wish you could be back in your straw mattress. Historians still argue whether shift workers maintained the 2-sleep system or adapted to a more fractured rhythm. Did bakers nap in short bursts, cobbling together rest wherever possible? Or did they still try to cling to the structure of 2 sleeps like everyone else? Evidence is thin, but court records and diaries hint that for many the pattern was broken. Their lives were polyphasic before the word even existed. You picture yourself standing with a night watchman. He leans on his staff, stamping his feet against the cold lantern swinging dimly. "All's well," he calls, though he looks more tired than reassuring. The street smells of damp straw and ale, the shadows shifting with the wind. For him, there is no second sleep waiting, only duty until the bells announce dawn. Or imagine the baker, hands white with flour, kneading by candlelight while the town lies quiet. The air in his bakehouse is warmer than most houses, ovens glowing red, yet his eyes are heavy. His first sleep ended hours ago, but his second never comes. Only the demand of bread for market stalls, and then there are travelers huddled in inns. A group stirs after first sleep, not to pray or gossip, but to hitch horses and press forward. The road is long and every hour matters. They ride into the dark, listening to the creak of wheels, praying the ruts don't break an axle. Their wakeful interval is permanent, dragging them straight into morning. You realize now that the 2-sleep system wasn't universal luxury. It was a privilege of stability. For many, the night was broken not by choice but by necessity. Soldiers stood watch, shepherds checked their flocks, midwives hurried across frosty fields when a baby chose to arrive between sleeps. The rhythm of night was elastic, bent by work and crisis. Back in your own bed, you smirk faintly, thinking about how little has changed. Today, nurses, factory workers, and long-haul drivers live on fractured schedules, waking and sleeping in odd rhythms. They may not call it first and second sleep, but the pattern is still there, pent around duty. As you close your eyes again, you hear the faint echoes of bakers kneading, watchmen stamping, and wheels clattering down muddy roads. Not everyone slipped into second sleep. Some carried the night on their shoulders so that others could rest. You stir again, though this time it isn't the draft or the shuffling of animals that pulls you from the edge of second sleep. It's the sound of something ticking. It's faint, steady, insistent. Of course, you wouldn't actually hear this in most Elizabethan homes, but by the late 16th century, a quiet revolution had begun, the rise of mechanical clocks. Alongside them came another intruder into the night, one that rattled the whole two-sleep system: coffee. The mainstream fact is that clocks grew increasingly common in European towns during the Elizabethan age. Public towers rang out the hours, pulling whole communities into a shared schedule. Wealthier households displayed wall or table clocks, their ticking and chiming enforcing a stricter sense of time. Sleep, once governed by darkness and dawn, began to be nudged by the steady beat of gears and bells. People became more aware of when they woke, not just that they woke. Midnight wasn't just the middle of the night anymore, it was 12 o'clock, sharp. Here's a quirky tidbit. Early clocks were notoriously inaccurate. Some lost or gained hours each day, and yet people still trusted them as arbiters of order. Imagine waking between first and second sleep, checking your household clock, and realizing it says it's nearly morning, only to discover at dawn that it was off by 3 hours. Elizabethans grumbled, but they also marveled at the novelty. Even a faulty clock felt like progress. Historians still argue how much clocks truly reshaped sleep patterns. Did people abandon natural rhythms for artificial ones? Or did they simply layer mechanical time over the older cycle of first and second sleep? Some suggest the chiming of public clocks disrupted rest, nudging people awake at predictable intervals. Others argue that people ignored clocks when it suited them, still trusting their bodies more than brass gears. And then came coffee. Introduced to England in the early 17th century, coffee houses quickly became hubs of conversation, politics, and business. Though this was just after Elizabeth's reign, the seeds were already being planted. Coffee extended waking hours, encouraging people to linger later into the night and wake earlier in the morning. The two-sleep rhythm, so neatly tied to candlelight and natural darkness, began to wobble under the influence of caffeine. You picture yourself stumbling into one of London's first coffee houses. It's smoky, crowded, buzzing with chatter. Merchants argue over trade, pamphleteers scribble notes, and someone loudly proclaims that coffee cures everything from melancholy to gout. You sip the bitter liquid, and suddenly the idea of going back to bed for second sleep feels unnecessary. Coffee doesn't just sharpen your mind. It shoves you out of the old rhythm and into something new. Back in the chamber, though, you're still in the cusp between old and new worlds. The bell from a nearby tower tolls the hour, more precise than the watchman's cry. It reminds you that the night is measurable now, not infinite. The idea of slipping naturally between sleeps is already becoming complicated, tied to schedules and gears. And you smirk at the irony. For centuries, Elizabethans flowed with the rhythm of dark and dawn. Then came clocks to regiment their hours, and coffee to fuel longer wakefulness. Together, they planted the seeds of the modern obsession with efficiency, even in sleep. You roll over again, hearing the phantom tick of gears, and wonder if maybe second sleep was doomed the moment someone wound a clock and someone else brewed a pot of coffee. The night was no longer just yours. It belonged to machines and mugs. You shift beneath the covers, the phantom tick of clocks still echoing faintly in your thoughts, and you realize something. This whole two-sleep rhythm is heading toward its end. The Elizabethans lived in a world of long nights and dim light, but the centuries that followed would drag humanity into a brighter, louder, faster rhythm. By the time the industrial age thundered in, the old habit of first and second sleep had nearly vanished. The mainstream fact is that industrialization changed not just how people worked, but how they slept. Factories needed workers at strict hours. Bells and whistles demanded punctuality, and the new rhythm of wage labor left little room for a leisurely midnight pause. Sleep began to condense into one block. Go to bed after work, rise in time for the shift whistle. The natural flow of two sleeps gave way to the mechanical cadence of capitalism. Here's a quirky tidbit. Gas lighting, first introduced in London in the early 19th century, made nights startlingly bright. Streets glowed, theatres extended performances, and people lingered in shops long after dark. Suddenly, staying awake past midnight wasn't only possible but fashionable. Imagine your Elizabethan ancestor walking into a gas-lit street for the first time. It would look like sorcery, an endless twilight where no one needed to stumble back to bed after the first sleep. Historians still argue about when exactly segmented sleep disappeared. Some say the 18th century already saw the decline as coffee houses and urban nightlife eroded the old rhythm. Others insist it lingered well into the 19th century, especially in rural communities where darkness and long nights remained. What's clear is that by the time electricity became widespread, the practice had faded into memory, an old oddity occasionally mentioned in folk sayings or dusty books. You picture the transition in slow motion. A London worker, once accustomed to rising at midnight for prayers or chores, now stumbles home exhausted from a factory shift, collapsing into bed for one uninterrupted block of rest. They, middle-class family, proud of their new gas lamps, stay up late reading novels, their children growing used to later bedtimes. The second sleep no longer fits. The schedule has no gap for it. The loss was gradual but profound. The shared interval of midnight prayers, gossip, and quiet reflection dwindled. People stopped expecting to wake at 2 in the morning. Waking became insomnia, a problem to be solved rather than a normal stage of the night. The language of first sleep and second sleep faded from diaries, plays, and common speech. A pattern that had stretched across Europe for centuries slipped away so thoroughly that most people today don't even know it existed. You lie back, imagining the dissonance. For an Elizabethan, waking in the night was natural, expected, even useful. For a factory worker in the 19th century, it was wasted time, time that could threaten productivity. You smirk. Somewhere between candles and clocking in machines, humanity convinced itself that efficiency mattered more than rhythm. Outside, the world of industry still hums in your imagination. Steam engines hissing, whistles blowing, streets glowing with gaslight. The noise is constant, the light relentless. There is no space for the old intermission. Sleep has been corralled into one tidy utilitarian block, ready to serve the working day. And as your eyes drift shut again, you can't help but think that something was lost. Not just the two halves of sleep, but the softness of a night that once belonged to prayer, gossip, dreams, and a little mischief at 2 in the morning. You turn onto your back, staring at the darkened beams above, and think about how strange it is that something once so ordinary could vanish almost entirely, until modern science stumbled upon it again. The story of two sleeps didn't end with gas lamps and factory whistles. It was rediscovered centuries later, like an artifact buried in your own biology. The mainstream fact is that in the 1990s, a researcher named Thomas Weir conducted a famous experiment. He put volunteers into a world without artificial light, only natural darkness for 14 hours each night. So at first the subjects slept long and unevenly, but soon a rhythm emerged. They began to divide their nights into 2 distinct sleeps, one heavy early phase, then a wakeful interlude, then a second, lighter phase. Without alarms, screens, or electric lamps, their bodies naturally reverted to the very pattern the Elizabethans had known. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of the volunteers reported that the waking interval between sleeps felt unusually calm, almost meditative. Instead of tossing and turning with frustration, they described entering a state of relaxed alertness, neither fully awake nor fully asleep. One participant even said it felt like floating. Imagine your 3 a.m. insomnia suddenly reframed as a blissful, doctor-approved floating session. You'd never fear it again. Historians still argue whether this experiment proves that biphasic sleep is humanity's true natural rhythm, or whether it was just one adaptation among many. Was the Elizabethan two-sleep system universal biology, or a cultural overlay amplified by long nights and scarce candles? The debate remains lively, but the experiment at least proved that segmented sleep lies within our potential. Lurking under the modern veneer, you imagine yourself back in that windowless lab room. No clocks, no phones, no glowing screens, just long darkness. At first, you'd probably panic, missing your favorite shows, worrying about emails piling up. But after a few weeks, your nights might stretch into a rhythm that felt oddly familiar. Sleep, wake gently, then sleep again. Your body would whisper across centuries, "See, we remember." Modern sleep scientists now talk openly about segmented sleep, pointing out that historical records align with experimental results. Some even argue that insomnia, the kind where you wake in the middle of the night and can't fall back asleep, might simply be your body remembering its older rhythm. Instead of cursing at the ceiling, perhaps you're meant to rise, read, pray, or just sit in the quiet before second sleep takes you again. The rediscovery has sparked fascination outside science too. Wellness gurus toy with biphasic schedules. Survivalists point to it as proof of natural resilience, and insomniacs cling to it as consolation. "I'm not broken. I'm Elizabethan." You chuckle at the thought of someone proudly announcing at brunch, "Oh, I still follow the segmented sleep model." Very authentic. But beneath the modern trendiness lies something deeper. The realization that human sleep has never been a one-size-fits-all affair. For centuries it flexed to the environment, candles, clocks, curfews, and coffee. And even now, hidden under the glow of screens, the two-sleep rhythm waits, ready to surface when given enough darkness. You close your eyes, half dreaming of scientists in lab coats, peasants by the fire, and nobles sipping spiced wine at midnight, all bound by the same quiet truth. The body remembers what the mind forgets. And maybe, when you next wake at 3 a.m., you'll think less of broken sleep and more of a long-lost rhythm calling you back. You shift against the sagging ropes of the bed, the blanket heavy across your chest, and your thoughts tumble toward a curious game, comparing the old myths about sleep with the ones that buzz through your own world today. It turns out, Elizabethans weren't the only ones obsessed with bedtime rules and half-baked wisdom. Every age, it seems, invents its own strange folklore about how to rest. The mainstream fact is that early modern people carried a whole toolbox of sleep lore. They believed, for example, that sleeping too much was dangerous. It could clog the body with phlegmatic humors and make you sluggish or sick. 8 hours straight would have sounded extravagant, even suspicious. A solid night was fine, but excess marked you as lazy, perhaps morally weak. The perfect solution: 2 measured doses of slumber, with productive waking sandwiched in between. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Elizabethans swore by bizarre remedies to secure good dreams or ward off nightmares. One suggestion involved tucking a piece of raw onion under your pillow to sweeten your visions. Another recommended tying a sprig of rosemary to your bedpost. You can't help but imagine the sensory clash, dozing off in a crowded chamber, your neighbor muttering prayers while your pillow reeks like soup. At least you keep the fleas away. Historians still argue whether these practices reflected genuine belief or playful superstition. Did people truly expect onions to cure nightmares, or was it closer to today's fad gadgets? Sleep masks with built-in Bluetooth, herbal sprays promising miracle rest. The blurred line between earnest faith and placebo comfort has always been there, bridging centuries. Now glance at your own world. You're bombarded with myths too. That everyone must sleep exactly 8 hours, that blue light glasses will fix your insomnia, that billionaires function best on 4 hours a night. You've heard of sleep hacks, from magnesium gummies to ice baths, each one marketed as revolutionary. And you smirk, because it isn't much different from a 16th century guide telling you to roll onto your right side after first sleep to settle digestion. Different centuries, same sales pitch. The Elizabethans had dream manuals. You have dream apps that claim to track REM cycles. They sprinkled charms to ward off witches. You plug in white noise machines to drown out the neighbor's car alarm. They feared demons pressing on their chests in the night. You call it sleep paralysis and Google it at 3 a.m. You're both trying to explain the same mystery, just in different languages. And then there's the stigma. In Elizabethan times, not waking in the middle of the night might have seemed odd. You'd miss the prayers, the quiet tasks, the social chatter. Today, the opposite is true. If you wake at 2 a.m., you're insomniac. Your sleep is broken. Each age sets its own standard of normal and makes people anxious about meeting it. Maybe the biggest myth of all is that there's only one correct way to sleep. You turn on your side, letting the blanket bunch at your chin, amused by the parallels. People 5 centuries ago whispered about omens in dreams, while you whisper about melatonin dosage and screen time. They hung sprigs of herbs. You buy blackout curtains. They feared witches. You fear emails. But in both cases, sleep remains a stage where superstition, science, and desperation collide. And maybe that's the real lesson. The myths aren't just nonsense. They're ways of taming the dark, of making the uncontrollable seem manageable. Whether it's rosemary sprigs or sleep-hacking podcasts, you're really just doing what Elizabethans did, trying to find comfort in the fragile hours between waking and dreams. The fire has burned down to ash. The barnyard outside is beginning to stir, and faint grey light presses through the shutters. You pull the blanket up one last time and feel the weight of the story you've been drifting through. The Elizabethan night was never empty. It was a tapestry of first sleep, waking hours, and second sleep. Now in this last stretch, you watch the candlelight fade into memory, the old rhythm dissolving as dawn arrives. The mainstream fact is that by the 18th and 19th centuries, the language of first sleep and second sleep began to vanish from diaries, plays, and letters. What had once been so ordinary became invisible. People no longer expected to wake at midnight. They expected one single, uninterrupted block of rest. Waking became a flaw, an illness to cure. Within just a few generations, a pattern that had defined centuries disappeared almost completely from cultural memory. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some rural pockets, the memory lingered. Folklorists collecting stories in the 19th century stumbled across elderly farmers who casually mentioned second sleep, as if everyone still knew what it meant. To them, it wasn't nostalgia. It was just the way their parents and grandparents had lived. Imagine the surprise of a Victorian gentleman, hearing his farmhand speak in the language of centuries past, like stumbling across a fossil that's somehow still alive. Historians still argue why the memory faded so quickly. Was it clocks and coffee, gas lamps and factories? Or did the rising obsession with efficiency simply crush the softer, stranger rhythms of the night? No single answer fits, but the fact remains. The two sleep systems slipped quietly into the past, leaving behind little more than scattered mentions in old books. You sigh, stretching under the covers, knowing the story is winding down. The Elizabethan chamber fades, its smoky air dissolving. The creak of the rope bed, the mutter of prayers, the shuffle of servants all dim into silence. Only the idea remains that night was once divided, that sleep was once shared, that people once lived by a rhythm your own body might still remember if you gave it darkness long enough. Now, as the final traces of candlelight vanish, it's time to drift fully out of the story and into your own rest. Let yourself breathe slowly now, deeper and calmer with each inhale. The voices of the Elizabethan chamber are gone. The watchman's cry has faded. The rooster waits for another dawn. You're left only with the soft hum of quiet, a rhythm steady and safe. Picture the old bed one last time, curtains drawn, blankets heavy, fire glowing faintly in the hearth. You don't need to think about straw poking your ribs or fleas nibbling at your ankles. Just imagine the weight of warmth, the gentle hush of night all around you. The people inside that chamber are falling back into their second sleep, drifting away with calm certainty that morning will come. You're invited to join them. The debates of physicians, the muttered gossip, the flicker of candlelight, all of it can slip away now. You don't need to remember the superstitions or the clock towers or the tick of gears. Let it all fade like smoke curling into the rafters. The night is longer than you think, and it holds you quietly, without demand. If your mind stirs with thoughts, let them pass as if they were Elizabethan dreams. Strange, fleeting, half-formed, dissolving into dawn. You don't need to chase them. Just breathe, sink, and trust the rhythm. The story has carried you from candlelit chambers to factory whistles, from psalms to gossip, from superstition to science. Now there is no need for more history, only rest. You're safe. The night is gentle and your body knows what to do. Close your eyes. Feel the softness beneath you, the blanket above you, the space between waking and dreaming. Stay there, linger. Let yourself drift, not toward first sleep or second sleep, but into your own endless quiet rest.